Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is going to be an exciting podcast up ahead. I know that because, well, I don't know, but I'm going to hope so anyways. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to talk about lots of great stuff today. Going to be discussing in a little while political correctness on university campuses and why one school, it's a few schools, but one in particular, is going as far as to say that even being in the presence of white people could be an act of racism. And not against whites, ironically enough. We'll be talking about that later on as well. Going to be discussing Elizabeth May's drunken outburst. Oh, no, wait. She wasn't drunk. She was just sleep-deprived or something. We'll talk about that later on as well. And lots more great stuff on the program. But I wanted to begin talking about Hydro One's decision to fire one of its high-paid public servants following an outburst by said public servant on TV. You know the prank. It's the F her right in the P prank. F being the verb that is a synonym for copulation, and P being the thing of which Rob Ford has more than enough to eat at home. I'm great at playing match game, clearly. The reality is, this prank is, or was, a little bit amusing when it first started off. Not gonna lie, I found it to be a bit amusing when I first saw the couple of videos online. Childish, yes. Jejune, very much. But what the heck? Good for a little chuckle. And then it got old. Very quickly. It became ripe with copycats, people that weren't particularly clever, people that just enjoyed bombarding journalists with the slogan. Most journalists handled it classily, shrugging it off and moving on. It happened to me several months ago on my radio show. I was talking about something completely unrelated. Someone calls in, as my show in London, Ontario, on AM 980 invites, and they say it. And your call screener can do the best job possible to get people out that are going to do something like that, but sometimes people slip through. Unfortunately, someone else then slipped through later on in the same segment. Thank goodness for delays. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a clever prank, but it is a widely known prank. So much so that some journalists report having had it done to them 10 times a day. At least that was the claim by Shauna Hunt, a reporter at City News in Toronto, who was covering on Sunday the Toronto Football Club match, and like any other sporting event, encountered many drunken fans, one of which dropped the F her right in the P line on her while she was interviewing another drunken fan. And I'm going to play for you a clip of Shauna Hunt. It's a montage, actually, of some of the interviews and discussions that she made on Sunday after the game in Toronto. And if ever you hear a bleep, it's obviously someone saying a profane line, but I want you to pay specifically close attention to the last voice you hear. The man who talks about his mother, because he's going to be a very central figure to this discussion very shortly.
2-1 is better than.
Hey.
We got.
So were you guys waiting? Hold on. Were you guys waiting around to see if you could F her and the P me live on TV?
Yes.
Is that what you were waiting?
Not you, but yes.
You were? Seriously?
Yes.
Can I ask why you would want to do something like that?
I feel like it's
Because he's wearing the shades,
quite substantial.
No, seriously. Why? I mean, it's a disgusting thing to say. It's degrading to women, and
But
you
where
would
else are you gonna do it?
You would humiliate me on live television?
Not you. Are you actually filming this?
Well, because you know what? I'm sick of this. I get this every single day, 10 times a day by
I'm sick of
rude
it.
guys like
I'm
you.
sick of it.
Like,
Hilarious. I don't care what
Treat.
you say.
It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with everyone else.
when you talk into my microphone and say that into my camera to viewers at the station I work at, it is disrespectful and degrading to me.
It's
Okay, why is it so funny though? Why is it so funny?
hilarious.
Why?
We're not the only people. It happened in England.
You know that it's old It's really not funny.
It's been like a year.
It's been longer than
You're
that.
lucky there's not a vibrator in the air like in England, because it happened all the time. It's amazing. And I respect it.
If your mom saw you talk
my mom would die laughing eventually.
That man, Sean Simoes, was, up until earlier this week, an employee of Hydro One. He was a network assistant management engineer and officer, made $106,000 a year, well-paid public employee on the Sunshine List, and his employer is not necessarily relevant here. But I think a lot of people used him just to take out their general frustration with Hydro One, the Ontario government's hydro bureaucracy. If that's the case, if you just hate him because he works for Hydro One, I totally support you. But most people hate him because he was complicit in what a lot of people are saying is an act of sexism, an act of sexual harassment, an act of sexual assault. I think he's a participant in an act of vulgarity and immaturity. And this is the problem here, is that a lot of media people have taken this F her right in the P prank and just let it roll off their shoulders. Because you know what? When you're doing a live broadcast, stuff happens. When you're doing a live radio show, stuff happens. When you're doing anything that involves an interaction with the general public, stuff is going to happen. And you know what? It's impossible to completely protect yourself from the unknown. That's why you need to be a certain type of person to work in media. Well, to be honest, there's a pretty low bar for working in media in other ways. But certainly you need to be able to think on your feet. And I guess the one issue I have with this, several issues, as a matter of fact, is that the man in question who has attracted most of the ire of people in this now viral video from Shauna Hunt of City News, he never even said it. He never even said the catchphrase. Now, he did give that very weird line, "You're lucky there's not a vibrator in your effing ear." I don't even know where that came from. And I'm not going to lie to you, I actually Googled vibrator in the ear just to see if I know I'm probably going to regret doing that when I start seeing targeted Google ads for that. But I typed that in thinking, okay, maybe there's some reference that I missed. And all I learned is that apparently it's actually a great way to handle a congested ear. So if you're having difficulties with your ears, this is apparently something you can do. But I digress. He never even said the catchphrase. He was with a guy who was defending someone else who said it. They were all drunk, and that doesn't excuse their actions, but it puts it in context here. Normally, a drunk person would never in a million years be sought out as a viable source by a journalist. Yet Shauna Hunt interviews several drunk men outside a sporting match, where I'm assuming that hooting and hollering and catcalling are all par for the course. And again, I'm not saying that makes it right, but I'm saying we have to have a bit of context here. She's asking him the questions. She's going up to him. She's approaching him and getting him to talk into a microphone. Now, that doesn't mean that what he said wasn't stupid. It absolutely was. But we're talking about a guy who has been the victim of the social media mob. And it cost him his job. It was a well-paying job, yes. It's a job that I would probably say, just given my own personal predispositions about Hydro One, is probably not going to be that much missed by the taxpayers. I just wish they wouldn't replace him. But was firing an appropriate remedy for this? And to be clear, I maintain that every employer has the right to hire or fire employees for whatever reasons it wants to. I'm very much a libertarian in that respect. But most people aren't. The laws themselves do not have a libertarian approach to what employers can do. In fact, the law is very clear about not being able to discriminate against people. Well, I'm not saying he's a victim here. I'm not saying he's been discriminated against. But a lot of the people that are calling for his head on a platter are the same people that would hate it if an employer fired an employee for anything else that had to do with something in their personal life. This man did not represent himself as working for Hydro One. He was not on duty. He was not on the clock. He was not in uniform. The only way I found out he worked from Hydro One was after he already got fired. So I don't know if someone found out and knew him or if Hydro One sort of preempted this and saying that we're aware of this problem. I don't know what the timeline was. But I know that the mob defined the narrative. And that's not to say that the mob is always wrong. But they are exactly that. A bunch of people who have no vested interest in Hydro One, no vested interest in Sean Simos, and who don't particularly care about the issue, about Toronto FC, about City News, even about the effort right in the P prank, got to define what happened with this man's life. Very real consequences for a few seconds of unplanned discussion, if you can even call it that. Look, I don't want to give the guy credit where it's not due here. So I have to take issue with how people are characterizing this prank, unfunny and immature as it may be, as more than just that. People are trying to claim that it's personalized. And the fact that I've been hit with it, and many other male journalists, seems to break that a little bit. But here's what one City News reporter said about it in a City News feature about the City News incident.
So why is it okay? Like, what is it that makes them think that this is okay? Because it's a verbal assault. It just is, pure and simple. It's a verbal assault. And it doesn't make, I mean, we're reporters. We know we need to be tough. We know we need to let things roll off our backs. But there's something really wrong about this because it does feel like an assault.
I think calling it an assault is very much a dishonest characterization of things. What I didn't play is the same reporter said that she's had it happen to her maybe about a dozen times, and in most cases it didn't matter. She said the one time it bothered her the most was when a young student who she said was about 9 years old came up to her and said it. The time it happened to me, or I guess the times it happened to me, it annoyed me, it frustrated me. As someone who takes pride in my work, it annoyed me. But you handle it, you say, I'm sorry you had to hear that, and you move on. And most other journalists I've seen who have had this happen to them have done something very similar. So I don't get why this is addressed in that way. And I should tell you that on Monday, when this was just making its way around the internet, before Simos was actually fired, though, I was talking about this on my show, and I was specifically responding to what Calgary police said. Because the Calgary Police Service said, and this was also in the initial city report on the matter, that they were prepared to press criminal charges against anyone who did an effort right in the P prank to a Calgary media outlet. And they went so far as to seek a legal opinion on this, and they sent out a letter to all broadcasters in Calgary saying, hey, if this happens, report it to us, and we'll deal with this. And a spokesperson for the Toronto Police Service said something very similar. They were not as unequivocal as Calgary. Calgary actually gave the provision of the criminal code, which was essentially causing a disturbance in the public place. Toronto said there were a number of charges that they could consider, and they would take it on a case-by-case basis. And I think to bring this into a criminal realm is absurd. We're not dealing with something here that should be treated as a criminal offense. Whatever happened to the good old days where you could just whack someone who came up? Hit him with a microphone, kick him in the shin, I don't know. I'm not encouraging people to assault someone, but if you're saying that you honestly think that someone saying 6 words is an assault to you, an assault, not just an annoyance, not an insult, not a jab, not a taunt, not even a threat, but an actual assault. You're severely diluting what assault means. Now, I have seen cases where someone has literally run up and snatched a mic from someone's hands. These are a little bit more dramatic, admittedly. And I've never had that happen to me. But someone yelling something at you, coming up behind you and saying it into a microphone, walking up in front and saying it into a microphone, these are stupid, childish pranks. And as much as I support in any case, not just this one, in any case, the free market being able to essentially have its due, and companies being able to say, we're looking out for our brand, we are distancing ourselves from this person, I also think that when other people get involved in these situations, it turns into, ironically enough, what the left hates, which is bullying, or what the left claims to hate. And at the end of the day, do I know what the proper solution would have been? No, I don't. Because once this man is identified, I recognize that Hydro One has been forced into a place of having to act. Whether they wanted to or not, it becomes their problem. And I also get that City News was trying to capitalize off of something, perhaps out of frustration or perhaps because they simply saw that, hey, this is something that could go viral, and clearly did. And there's been several days of a continuous media cycle that has erupted from this. People are heralding Shauna Hunt for her bravery, and I certainly think Shauna Hunt was good at maintaining her composure. The problem is that she didn't really make her point in such a way that these hooligans were going to take it. They all just sort of rolled their eyes, walked away, then came back, and they didn't really learn their lessons from this. So I'm assuming they have now. I'm assuming that Samoes has learned his lesson now that he's out $106,000 a year. And he and 3 others, by the way, have also been banned by Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment from attending for the next year anything on their property. But how much of that was needed? When you have just the general public shame and ridicule that would come from having their faces known in the first place. I'd venture a guess to say that would be a bit more of a humbling experience than needing to go through this. And to be clear, you have the right to free speech, absolutely. And free speech does not mean you have the right to consequence-free speech. I, working in radio, know this. Sure, I can legally say what I want. Well, I guess you have CRTC regulations. I can, for the most part, say what I want, but that doesn't mean that I have the right to say it without people challenging it. And I love debate. I love discussion. And what Shauna Hunt did was challenge this man who said this thing that she and most other Canadians found objectionable. And at the end of it, he looked like an idiot. He looked like an ass. His friend, who was far more front and center in the video, I don't know his name yet, he looked like an even bigger ass. Why was anything more than that needed? And how did it impact his ability at Hydro One to perform his duties? Those hydro bills aren't going to be improperly inflated all by themselves. They need a good team behind them to do it. And I'm assuming, given how much he was fetching there, he did his job well. I mean, that's neither here nor there. It doesn't matter whether it's Hydro One, doesn't matter whether it's TELUS, doesn't matter whether it is TD Bank. What matters is that he is now unemployed, and not only unemployed, and he can't even go to sporting events for the next year. So I don't know what he's going to do to fill his time, but will be forever tarnished with this. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's warranted, but there is no nuance and no subtlety in how social media justice is delivered. It goes from 0 to 100 in less than a second. And it's based on extremities. I saw several tweets today and yesterday that were saying, make sure you include Sean Samoes' full name every time you tweet about him, so it's going to show up forever when someone Googles him. And I've seen this in other cases as well, people whose lives have been ruined because of deliberate social media campaigns, deliberate with a specific goal of not just punishing the person right away, but forever. And this actually was something that came up not long ago. Brian Lilly, fellow rebel, had wrote something on Facebook, I think it was, about the man who was publicly shamed after he tried to publicly humiliate a Chick-fil-A employee over the company's stance on gay marriage. You remember, this was a few years ago. The guy goes through the drive-thru, demands a free glass of water, berates the employee. He ended up posting this video on YouTube. He then lost his job. And he posted an apology, and he's saying that years later, he's still having trouble getting over it. And I actually felt bad for the guy. Because as much as I was against him then and still thinks what he did was wrong, I do think people can actually learn. I think people can actually grow. I think people can outgrow those immature moments, especially if you're looking at a case like this where alcohol was involved. And I don't think anyone can say that they can account and defend every single remark they've made while intoxicated, especially after a sporting event, because then you have a different type of mob mentality, which is a bunch of people there. It's a free, fair atmosphere. It's warm weather. Everyone's outside, alcohol and warm weather and excitement and partying. And I'm not even a drinker. I'm not even someone who drinks, so I don't really have a vested interest in defending, the moral integrity of people who are drunk. But I recognize that it is not an accurate reflection, necessarily, of who these people are. And I know you'll get people that'll say, oh, well, when you're drunk and your inhibitions are down, you'll say things that you would love to say at any other time. Well, maybe so. We'll be talking about Elizabeth May soon enough, so I think alcohol will come up in that discussion as well. As much as this man's comments were indefensible, so is the response to them. And never become what you claim to oppose. And that's a memo I think the left needs more than anyone else. We got to take a quick break here. More of Lawton Online comes up in just a couple of moments on TheRebel.media. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media.
We are back on the program here on Lawton Online, a podcast exclusively on TheRebel.media. And I wanted to shift gears. I know it's been a few days old now, but I still think it's important, especially since we've seen the leftist pundits weigh in on this, and that is the other drunken, profane rampage that has unfortunately not resulted in someone being fired, and that is Elizabeth May's parliamentary press gallery speech over the weekend. It was a bad weekend for alcohol and profanity, I must say. And interestingly enough, in contrast with Sean Samoza's remarks to City TV, I believe there was actually more profanity, more swearing, and inevitably more alcohol in Elizabeth May's speech. But she actually instead goes on TV more and apologizes for it. So maybe they aren't related, but I still think that's worth noting. Elizabeth May's speech on Saturday was very odd. Lisa Raitt even said as much into the microphone. Very bizarre. But what's been more interesting to me has been the response to it. And I think more people are honing in on May's remarks about Omar Khadr. And don't get me wrong, I'll get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to play for you, first off, the weirder part. There's no better way to put it. The odder part and more bizarre element of May's speech. And that was what came right before the Khadr bit. And this is what she was doing when Lisa Raitt started approaching the stage to get rid of Elizabeth May. Now, personally, I think she could have just left her up there, and it would have been interesting to see what happened. But this was a lighter fare, and if you watch the whole video, which, by the way, is 9 minutes long, and did not get released until people really started pushing for it. This was not going to be something that was for public eyes, which is fascinating to me because it was a room full of journalists. But I digress. This was from Elizabeth May's speech at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner on Saturday evening.
The thing is, our parliamentary democracy is all of us are equal. But the thing is, I'm the only woman party leader, and I know what men immediately think. Because the poor boys, they really bought into Freud. That whole sexual maturation thing on the Freudian scale, that we go from the oral, I'm not going to eat the mic, into the anal, God, I don't want to think about it, or the genital. Guys get stuck on this Freudian stuff, so they immediately assume that I'm envious of the things the boys have that I don't have. They assume that I suffer from classical Freudian debate envy. But I no longer do. Praise the Lord, free at last. I am not suffering from debate envy because, thanks to a few of the boys, I get to be in the debates. Yes, it will be fun. I'm looking forward to it. And I am happy to say we are all equal and we get to participate as equals. So that's that on that. But you know what? I have a completely deranged and there is no sequitur. This is a non sequitur. Do you guys ever wake up with old theme songs from former black and white TV shows that you never thought your kids would ever see, and they're running through your head. Like every now and then I wake up thinking about, Lisa, you've got to wait. Lisa.
Okay, we're going to wait as well. When people started cheering, that was when Lisa Raitt got up on stage. Now, that should tell you enough about how this was being received, or perhaps not being received by the audience. When people start cheering, when the MC, who I don't even think is a very popular cabinet minister to begin with among the media, when they start cheering when she gets up on stage, you know they are not happy with Elizabeth May's performance. But that's neither here nor there. Because it's meant to be a performance, it's meant to be self-mocking, it's meant to be something that gets people to laugh, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a comedian, per se. I think anyone who's ever heard me attempt to tell a joke would tell you and agree I'm not a comedian. But I know a little bit about comedy. I know how to recognize when something is bombing. And this is where Elizabeth May seems to have failed. She missed the entire tone of the event. Now, I'm going to read very shortly about Heather Malik, unfortunately. But bear with me here, because Heather Malik says, no. Elizabeth May was much needed in terms of preserving the tone of the event. But here's the quote that you all know by now, but I have to play it just for context here.
So I wake up thinking about a horse is a horse, of course. This morning I wake up thinking this. Why am I thinking this? Do you guys wonder?
Liz,
hang on.
We wonder why you're thinking that too, but
Wait, you know what? Do you guys remember the theme song? Welcome back. Who knew Cotter was spelled K-H-A-D-R? Welcome back, Omer Cotter. It matters to say it. Welcome back, Omer Cotter. You're home. Doesn't it strike you as unusual? I didn't use up my time.
no, you didn't. There's a lot unusual about your speech, Liz, but we're going to take off.
Omer Cotter, you got more class than the whole fucking cabinet. Thank you.
And then comes the very polite and very confused laughter from a bunch of Ottawa journalists. Now, that audio there was from the CBC feed, which was made public only after Huffington Post reporter Althea Raj's cell phone video was made public. And what I like about this one is that you are exposed to a great deal more detail in the audio than you are normally from where Althea Raj was sitting. Such as example, you see, first off, Lisa Raitt actually dragging Elizabeth May from the microphone, but Elizabeth May trying to negotiate to stay up on stage. She's saying, I didn't use up my whole time. And no, she didn't, but you used up everyone's patience, which I think is more valuable than their time in many cases. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the last segment, talking about something else, is that it's not fair to shame or mock people. And you know what? I think that is to some extent fair. But I also think when you're dealing with a public leader, someone whose public persona and someone whose public presence is a part of their job, the line between, oh, this was my private life and this is my public life is virtually non-existent. This was Elizabeth May at work. So let that sink in. This was not her on her own time. This was Elizabeth May at work. And I was the next day at work, of course, like, normal human beings, not drunk like most normal human beings. And I was looking at a lot of TVs, and you saw Elizabeth May on every TV station imaginable. She was on CTV, she was on CBC, she was doing radio interviews, she was doing the circuit to tell people why she made such a buffoon of herself a couple of nights prior. And the story kept changing. She said, I don't want to be one of those people who blames cough medicine, but I was taking NyQuil. She says, I wasn't drunk, but, well, there was wine at the table, and I had some wine. She's saying, well, I was stressed. I was sleep deprived. Okay. Let's ask the obvious question here, which is how much can we trust someone who doesn't know you can't mix NyQuil with red wine to run the country? This is a woman who wants to be taken seriously as Prime Minister of Canada. There was a lot wrong with Elizabeth May's speech. There was a lot wrong with it. However, I'm a forgiving person sometimes. I'm prepared to forgive her, even though she made a mistake. Now, Heather Malik has gone one step further. This is the Star columnist who says, as the headline of her latest column, which came out on Tuesday of this week, there's nothing wrong. with Elizabeth May's speech. She says the Green Party leader was accused of not suiting the tone of the press gallery dinner, but what is the tone? She says the speech seemed fine to her. I also take issue with the factual error in the second paragraph, where Heather Malik says she's a human Canadian. She says, I like jokes. I like people being relaxed and fully themselves on stage. I like what some Ottawa journalists seem to disapprove of. People with, what's the word, personality. In fact, I rather demand it. She says, having seen the speech online, I never saw what May was accused of by the more pompous colonels in the audience. I don't like people complaining of ill health. It's always best to cover pain, both physical and emotional, with jokes. So I liked her saying her hip replacements made screeching noises. Yeah, that was a good bit. She said May didn't suit the tone of the evening. A bunch of guys named Robin, Ian, Marcel, Tim, and John complained. But what is the tone? I took at the tone register. I'm thinking dreary. I'm thinking muffled. I'll choose a Etobicoke Ratepayers Association. In a room filled with people who deal in words and fight for their right to go on at hideously boring length, May spoke relatively briefly. She didn't slur her words, and she wasn't drunk. Unquote. Frankly, I would say that if she were doing that sober, that would be more concerning than if she were doing that drunk. But maybe that's neither here nor there as well. And I must say, and I tweeted this out earlier this afternoon, and I said that I might not be the only one who does this, but I was curious if anyone else gets an error message when they try to read a Heather Malik piece saying there's no point wasting your bandwidth. But apparently she had blocked me on Twitter already, so I don't know. Maybe I said something in the past. I couldn't remember that. But she manages to go on for lengths without actually saying anything at all. She goes on and on and on talking about how apparently it's sexist that other people take issue with Elizabeth May or something. The fact is, if you see the whole speech, it's 9.5 minutes long. I wanted to play it for you, but I also wanted people to stay listening to the podcast, so I thought maybe I shouldn't play it. But if you listen to the whole thing, she never really has a winning line. She makes a couple of points that make good chuckles. I personally thought her bit about debate envy was good, but could have been shrunk down to 2 sentences and could have, gone on without her referencing oral and anal sex, something that still, I think, gives children nightmares who happen to have seen the speech. I don't have an issue with her saying the F word. What I have the most issue with, and I think most, as Heather Malik would call them, human Canadians take the most issue with, is Elizabeth May projecting class onto Omar Khadr. Now, for Elizabeth May to say that the whole cabinet doesn't have class, well, admittedly, politicians do set a pretty low bar for themselves, but to say Omar Khadr, a convicted terrorist scumbag, has more class than people like Jason Kenney, than people like Joe Oliver, than people like Stephen Harper, is disgusting. Omar Khadr has no more class than something I dropped off in the toilet this morning. And then I look at another piece in the Toronto Star by Thomas Welcome saying Elizabeth May's speech on Omar Khadr was profane but right. Her 9-minute speech, Welcome writes, was described by some present as bizarre, awkward, rambling, and profanity-laced. She's been mocked in editorial cartoons, attacked in print, and subjected to intense interrogation. There have been suggestions that she should quit as Green Party leader, but here's the thing. In a strange way, she made a lot of sense. And here's, I guess, where we have the most concerning reality of this. You have a media who loves Omar Khadr. And I think it took me a while to see that. Not because it surprises me, nor because it shocks me. I think when Omar Khadr was in jail, there were certainly a lot of cases where the media wasn't asking the tough questions. The media was especially critical of the government for doing its part to keep Khadr behind bars. But it wasn't that we saw as clear an explanation as there could be for how much the media is prepared to forgive Khadr for his crimes than the press conference in the driveway of Dennis Edney. And I know my colleague, Rebel Commander Ezra Levant, talked about this at great length as literally the man who wrote the book on Omar Khadr would. But the point that he didn't make in his videos, he did retweet me on Twitter when I mentioned this, and a lot of other people did as well, was that of the 23 questions asked to Omar Khadr by journalists in this press conference, only 2 of them were about terrorism. The rest were about everything from how he felt to what they were having for dinner. 2 about terrorism. And I think this is important, because when Elizabeth May has hitched herself to Omar Khadr, she's also endeared herself to the media that doesn't seem to think he is worthy of criticism. The Heather Malicks and the Thomas Walcombs of the world. Ultimately, this type of person, this type of so-called journalist, is the kind that occupies most of the parliamentary press gallery. They were the ones that room was stacked with last weekend. And I find it to be so bizarre. So bizarre that such a whitewashing of Omar Khadr's past has taken place. And Walcomb's column continues along saying that Khadr does, in fact, have more class than the whole effing cabinet. He says, quote, Khadr's response to being jailed almost half of his life for the crime of being a child soldier has been gracious and measured. The Harper government's response to Khadr has been anything but. This was one of the truths May told Saturday night. She may never make it on the after-dinner circuit, but in this instance, she did tell it as she saw it. Is that so awful? Well, I think when how you see it is so far from the truth, and when I think you're probably seeing double in the first place, it is relevant, and it is important, and it is shameful that this behavior is being given a pass. And I'm not even talking just about Elizabeth May here, because this discussion, this entire conversation of Elizabeth May's Parliamentary Press Gallery speech over the last few days has magnified into a discussion about Omar Khadr and the way the left sees him. Now, as someone who has more class than the whole effing cabinet, in the words of Elizabeth May, certainly on par with her level of class that evening, which was, well, virtually non-existent. But it's the hand-holding. The hand-holding of the Mays of the world, the hand-holding of the Khadrs of the world, 2 very different people, but both within the level of bias of the so-called media party. You know the one I'm talking about. The kind that decides what videos make it to air and what videos don't. And I see a lot of similarities, by the way, in the Elizabeth May speech and in the Omar Khadr driveway press conference, both with full videos that show a very different story. And I've not seen the Khadr driveway press conference video in which Dennis Edney tells people the rules of the event anywhere but on The Rebel. And that is shameful. The Elizabeth May press gallery speech as well. There was little more than just that one clip from Althea Raj for quite a while until the story got such legs that the full video had to be released. It's not like no media was there. They were all at that party. We got to take a break here. More of the Lawton Online podcast on TheRebel.media in just a couple of moments. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some universities that have gone overboard in coddling people, so much so that apparently being in the presence of white people is a racist microaggression. We're also going to be talking about one town council in Ontario that has decided it's not inclusive to sing the national anthem. That's coming up in just a couple of moments. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Small Dead Animals blogger Kate McMillan once wrote, maybe she wrote it more than one time, but at least once that stood out with me, that the opposite of diversity is university. And I think it also goes part and parcel with that old adage that liberalism is when you're so open-minded that your brains fall out, because universities seem to be bastions of little more than social engineering and political correctness now. And I'm not talking about your professional degrees or your practical degrees, like, for example, that of medicine or law. Well, actually, no, I don't want to mistake law school for something that's always useful. But, you know, med school, engineering, etc., biology, chemistry, these things. Not, you know, political science, social science. And I say this, by the way, as someone who majored in political science for my time at university. But the arts and humanities and social sciences have gone down this road of absolute uselessness. And when you look at stories like the ones I'm going to share right now, really an amalgam of, I think, everything that's wrong with university, at least an incomplete version of it. There's too much for an hour and a half long podcast even. But the first example comes out of Columbia University, where apparently classical mythology is too triggering for students, according to the school's Multicultural Affairs Advisory Board. They've called upon, in Columbia University's student newspaper, Columbia being one of the most esteemed universities in the country, by the way, professors to be more sensitive when teaching provocative or controversial material like that of the Roman classical poet Ovid. Now, you must forgive me. My knowledge of the Roman classical poet Ovid is a little bit limited compared to, I'm sure, students at Columbia University. I do know, though, that he's known for his book, The Metamorphoses, a 15-book narrative poem that covers 250 mythological stories. I know that because I read it on Wikipedia a few moments ago. And the book, written in dactylic hexameter. I knew that part. No, Wikipedia too. The point of this, though, is that like so many other of the classics, it has shaped modern literature. Like Chaucer did, like Shakespeare did, like Dante's Inferno did, like so many other things from that time period and before it and after it. They have helped define what we call literature today, which, in fairness, is not always that good. But some of the old myths that Ovid wrote or recounted involve sexual violence. For example, Zeus's daughter, Persephone, was kidnapped and raped by the god of the underworld. And the op-ed writers in the Columbia University student newspaper say that that is just too triggering to be taught in a university classroom. This is what they write. The class was instructed to read the myths of Persephone and Daphne, both of which include vivid depictions of rape and sexual assault. As a survivor of sexual assault, a student described being triggered while reading such detailed accounts of rape throughout the work. However, the student said her professor focused on the beauty of the language and the splendor of the imagery when lecturing on the text. As a result, the student completely disengaged from the class discussion as a means of self-preservation. She did not feel safe in the class. Clearly, the professor was right. I mean, if the explanation in the poem was so vivid that a student was actually forced to mentally disengage from the class, then, well, the imagery must have been absolutely phenomenal. But then you have other things as well. Like, I'm remembering going back to when I was in grade 11 or 12, and I had to read a book by Timothy Finley called The Wars. And this book, I didn't find it overly exceptional, depicted a very graphic gay rape scene. So you don't just have sexual assault there, but homosexuality as well by a World War I soldier. Now, The Wars is a book that obviously some people have tried to have banned because of this scene and others. But if I, as a high school student, a male high school student, and not a particularly mature one, I can assure you, was able to handle that, you would think that university students in a class about the classics would have a bit more of a sense of maturity about them. If not, then don't take the class. Why not just, silently disengage yourself until the class is over, then come back to reality, where the rest of us have to deal with? And I was reading about this in more detail. And I don't think that it's at all unreasonable that you may find something triggering if you were the survivor of a rape or any traumatic experience. And people, I think, should be sensitive to it. But that doesn't mean that we need a warning label on everything just because of how someone would respond. And it also doesn't mean that we need to be detaching ourselves, or should I say, disengaging ourselves from reality just because we need to protect someone else's feelings, real as they may be. And we see this in a lot of cases on university campuses with race relations. Like, for example, a story that also came out this week. Catherine Timp of National Review wrote it about University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where one report released said that being white is a microaggression against others. Now, a microaggression, I want to be very clear because I've mentioned these in the podcast before. A microaggression is when you've done nothing but someone else feels like you did something wrong and you have to believe them because, well, they're a marginalized group. But the report on racial microaggressions, creatively called racial microaggressions, looked at 4,800 students of color. And they found in one academic year more than 800 examples of microaggressions. Now, this is terrible if there's such racism that exists. But maybe we should look at how they actually define racism. Because according to this report, quote, just walking into or sitting in a classroom full of white people, unquote, is a microaggression. Quote, students of color reported feeling uncomfortable and unwelcomed just walking into or sitting in the classroom, especially if they were the only person of color or one of a few, unquote, stated the report. So walking into a room with white people helps make up the 800 alleged racial microaggressions that took place. Now, I look at other examples that were outlined in Catherine Timp's write-up here. And not all of them are ridiculous. Some of them are real examples of racism, but it's this conflation of aggression with microaggression that I think is so concerning. Apparently, one Asian student was told they have to go back to running a laundromat. Another student of color was he overheard other white students discussing admissions and saying the only reason Mexicans could get into the school was due to affirmative action. And I don't think anyone would deny that these things are offensive, but there's two things. A, in the real world, you can't get other people to shut up because they say something mean to you or mean about you. And B, these are not the same as you feeling bad because you walk into a room with white people. That is just an example of you being a pansy and nothing else. And the vast majority of the examples in this report fall into that category. One student reported being discouraged during meetings with an academic advisor because the student was a minority and the academic advisor was not. That, apparently, is also an example of a microaggression. An African-American male said, if I raise my hand and I'm not called upon, that's a microaggression. One student said receiving hostile reactions to participation in classroom discussion was a microaggression. Maybe it's because you're an idiot and not because you're a minority. I haven't heard what you said, but if you think that's an example of racism, then it's probably safe to say that things you're saying aren't particularly bright either. And again, I don't want to say that racism on campus doesn't exist, but anyone who is a genuine victim of actual racism is so disgusted, I can only assume, at hearing these instances of boutique racism being cast aside as though they are genuinely instances of marginalization. And it falls into other stories we've seen about discussions on white privilege and inequality presented as fact and not necessarily as theory. And students feel that they are entitled to feel safe. And I agree. I think you should feel safe. I think that you should be kept protected. But that does not extend to your emotional well-being. And I wanted to bring up a story from earlier this year. I think it actually came out in March. It was in the New York Times, and to the New York Times' credit, they did a phenomenal piece on this, talking about hiding from scary ideas. And the story focused on a woman at Brown University, a senior, who's a member of the school's sexual assault task force, and she takes it upon herself to make the university a safe place for rape victims, free from anything that might prompt traumatic memories, like, for example, classic Roman poetry, apparently. And they had an event in the fall that piqued her interest. It was a debate or a discussion between the founder of feministing.com and a libertarian. And it was on rape culture. And the libertarian, a woman by the name of Wendy McElroy, was there to criticize the term rape culture and its prevalence. And as it so happened, Catherine Byron, the sexual assault task force member, said that having a debate, having a discussion could be damaging. She said it would invalidate people's experiences. She tried to have the event shut down. Instead, she had a safe space advertised, where if any student was finding an event troubling or triggering, they were going to be offering space in a room that had, I kid you not, cookies, coloring books, bubbles, Play-Doh, calming music, pillows, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies. Just let that sink in for a moment. You don't like an idea that is contrary to one that you hold. So you have to run away down the hall to a room to watch a video of puppies and eat cookies. Don't get me wrong. I like puppies and I like cookies, but I don't feel like I'm owed a room that offers those things at any given moment. But this is what you're dealing with on 2015 university campuses. This is what you're dealing with and have been for the past however many years. A belief system that you are only as strong as the university's ability to protect you, as someone else's ability to protect you. Nothing to do with your own strength, nothing to do with your own ability to self-preserve, or what was the term earlier, to just disengage from reality around you. And hey, I don't deny anyone the right to come up with their own coping mechanisms, but when students eventually do leave university, because even if you're going to be one of these, 10-year studying, conflict management and women's studies majors, you're still eventually going to have to face the real world. Although I'm assuming this generation is probably going to be the most likely to have an overvaluation and an overpossession of PhDs simply because of people that don't want to leave school ever. They don't want to ever face a place where they might not have, puppies and cookies available for them if someone challenges you. I can just imagine, Miss Byron's first job in the real world. She's, taking advantage of the fact that she's a woman that can be treated as an equal finally after years of fighting. She's in the boardroom. She's a lawyer. Maybe she's a professional or an executive of some other kind, and she says, hey, I'd love for us to invest in the market of the Midwest by opening up our company's headquarters and moving it there. And someone says, well, actually, I don't think that's a good idea. So what does she do? Does she just well up and say, I need access to my safe space now? And they say, what safe space? Well, at university, if someone said something that we didn't like or that invalidated our belief, we got cookies and we got to watch a video of a puppy frolicking. And no, actually, many puppies frolicking. I can just imagine, everyone looking around in the room going, wait, what? But heck, give it 20 years and this will be the norm. Because heaven forbid you do the unthinkable, which is make someone think. And this is where we go into the very definition of political correctness, which is a belief system, a doctrine, really, that aims to exist only in the absence of truth. Because if something's not true, you don't need to hide from it. You can simply combat it with the truth. But if someone says something that's true and that you don't like, well, that's when you have to run away from it, put your head between your legs, and pretend it never happened. Don't put your head between your legs just yet, though. We have more of Lawton Online coming up in just a couple of moments. When we return, we're going to be discussing a case I mentioned earlier, a city, or I suppose a town in Ontario that has decided it is just not inclusive to sing the national anthem at council meetings. That's coming up in just a moment on Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media. Stay tuned.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
We are back on the program, but before we go on, I have to share something very important and very significant with you. Just bear with me. minute. No, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. Kill it. Apparently that's offensive to people. I know. True patriot love and sons commanding and mentioning God and asking him to keep our land and being patriotic and free. I still hear the music. No, these are apparently offensive concepts to people. And not for the obvious reasons. Not for the reasons that, Kim Campbell and Margaret Atwood a few months ago were trying to tell us. Not inclusive because it mentions thy son's command and is apparently sexist. You remember that private member's bill that didn't get off the ground, thankfully, to change the lyrics of the national anthem. But no, not inclusive just because. Just because. This was something that was apparently believed by 4 city councillors in Richmond Hill, Ontario, a suburb outside of Toronto. 4 councillors voted against it. Actually, it was 5, but the 5th one is in a category of her own. It was Councillor Karen Silovets. She said that town council had much legal advice on it, but, quote, I did not believe that O Canada was the appropriate manner in which to open our meetings. I felt the statement was a far more inclusive one at the municipal level, unquote. Now, I'll read the statement to which she was referring in just a moment, but I want to give you some backstory on this, because Richmond Hill decided it would entertain a motion put forth by one councillor, Greg Barrows, who said at a difficult time for Canada, it would be great to have everyone at the beginning of council meetings sing O Canada. He said it's reason to pause. Remember what an amazing country this is, how municipal government exists because men and women have fought for Canada and its freedoms. The mayor said, this is not about Canada's national anthem. I don't think any other city council does. Now, as it so happens, most don't, but Toronto does. The biggest city in Canada, one of the most ethnically diverse cities in Canada, manages to sing the national anthem without issue, without offending people. Now, Silovets has said that she's a proud Canadian. She said she would personally sing at any time, but she doesn't think it's inclusive. Here's what she opted to have read instead. Her and 4 of her colleagues, who by a vote of 5-4 managed to win, blocking O Canada from being at council meetings. The statement says, quote, tonight, council comes together as representatives of our town to conduct the town's business. We are glad to be joined by many of our engaged citizens, both at home and with us here in the council chambers tonight. May we use this time to hear from our residents, respond to the reports by the professional staff who inform us and make fair and responsible decisions in the best interests of our community. And I believe it ends with a collective yawn in the place of amen or, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. That's my only assumption. That's the most bureaucratic prayer in the history of the universe. It's not even a prayer at all. It's a statement to essentially pledge allegiance to the bureaucracy. I pledge allegiance to the town and to the bureaucracy for which it stands. One bureaucracy raising taxes with fixing potholes and higher spending for all. Or something like that. I don't know. I sure as heck can't figure out what they're trying to say in there. And why somehow that has to be read instead of the national anthem. And what I've yet to encounter, and I've tried looking at every comment and even points made in the debate to find out how at all it is offensive, and I can't find it. And if anyone invokes the tradition argument, well, no one else does it. Maybe, but even then I have to question why. And I was inspired in my own town, by the way, which is actually a city, but the city of London, Ontario. When I read this story, I emailed a lot of city councillors, and I asked them just what you think. Would you entertain this? Would you support singing the national anthem at the beginning of meetings? And I was actually quite moved by the response. I haven't heard back from everyone just yet, but I heard back from at least 2 councillors that said absolutely they would support that. One of them said he has no idea why they don't. Another councillor who actually chairs a committee that deals with procedural bylaws actually said I should put forward a formal request because she said she would support something like that. So, and I think in a lot of cases, it might just be something that no one has really thought of. But then we still have to face the question of why. What is it that apparently to some people is objectionable? I can't think of any immigrants, even those who are not citizens, who would be offended by the fact that we might have a sense of pride ourselves. who might be offended by other people singing a national anthem. Because even at the municipal level of government, it is still, in my eyes anyway, someone who is a steward of the country and of the province. What is a country but a collection of its provinces and a collection of its municipalities and those who live outside of them? So I don't care who it excludes. And what bothers me even more is the lack of acclaim of who was actually offended by this. I've not heard from any group, any ethnic group, any religious group, any political group that claims to have felt excluded by it. So shame on Richmond Hill. Richmond Hill had an opportunity here to go against the grain. Richmond Hill had the opportunity to be different. Unlike the other cities that have apparently, perhaps for the same reasons or perhaps just because no one's thought of it, go down the same road. But I think every city council and every town council and every hamlet council and every council of a regional municipality and every regional council, every government body should be filled with people who are proud to sing the national anthem. Any elected official who's ashamed of that or thinks someone else would be does not deserve to be one at all. We've got to take a break here. The final wrap-up of Lawton Online, including It Must Be a Liberal, comes up in just a couple of moments. Stay tuned.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
You heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal when we scour every corner of the globe from Vancouver to West Virginia to Seattle to Sao Tome and Principe, and we find the story so outrageous there must be a liberal involved. And today we go to the place that gives us, I think, the most of these stories, which is no further away than Jacksonville, Florida, where a Florida man turned himself in for murder. But it gets worse. Jeff Gaylord, 37 years old, entered the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office earlier this week, and he turned himself in for killing his friend of 7 years. He told officers that he stabbed his friend repeatedly with a kitchen knife, cut up his body with a hatchet, and buried the victim in his backyard. He said he wanted the death penalty for his crime. He said that his friend and roommate's room was a mess all the time with his toys and dolls. He said he left his empty vodka bottles all over the kitchen, never picked up his empty cocaine baggies, and left the toilet seat down when he peed. He messed up my apartment to the point where I just couldn't get it clean. Before he started doing drugs and acting weird, he was my BFF, my best friend forever. We'd go dancing, we'd play on the children's park equipment. We were both huge fans of doom metal. I don't even know what doom metal is. We'd listen to it for hours with the lights turned off. Okay, sounds like a weird relationship. He said they hadn't had a real conversation in nearly a year. The breaking point came when his friend crashed his Nissan Altima at Hooters. But Gaylord got arrested for it, not his friend. The problem is that his friend, named Mr. Happy, doesn't actually exist. This man, stoned out of his mind, turned himself in for the murder of his imaginary friend. And while the friend himself may have been imaginary and not real in the eyes of the law, nor in the eyes of any other human being, unfortunately, Mr. Gaylord was real. And as were the copious amounts of drugs and the machine gun that he had at his home that was only searched because of police. So I think it's safe to say when you turn in your imaginary friend and then get arrested for a real crime in the process, you must be a liberal. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.
Rebel.